The wind howled through the barren Montana hills, whipping snowflakes across the frozen landscape. In the distance, the silhouette of James Parker's coffee plantation stood tall against the darkening sky, its outlines sharp and unforgiving. The world was silent, save for the creaking of old barn doors, swaying in the biting cold. Then came a cry. It was faint but unmistakable, a baby's cry, breaking through the stillness like a beacon in the night. James Parker's hand froze mid-sip, the steaming mug of coffee spilling slightly on his calloused fingers. For a moment, he thought it was just the wind. But the cry came again, sharper this time. His heart skipped a beat, and his mind raced with thoughts of what it could be. He set the mug down and stood up slowly, his old bones creaking as he moved. Shadow, his black shepherd, bolted upright from his usual spot near the fireplace, ears pricked and body tense. The dog's usual calm demeanor was gone, replaced by an unsettling urgency. "Shadow," James murmured, his voice hoarse from years of silence. The dog didn't wait for permission. With a single glance at James, Shadow darted toward the barn, his paws crunching in the snow. James followed. The air was colder than usual, a biting chill that stung his cheeks. He reached the barn door, just as another cry echoed in the distance, this time accompanied by the sound of whimpering. James's heart pounded in his chest as he threw open the door, the heavy wood creaking in protest. Inside, by the dim light of the barn's single hanging bulb, he saw her, a young woman, no more than 25, her dark hair matted against her pale face. She was cradling a newborn in her arms, the baby's tiny cries echoing through the barn like a fragile plea for life. Shadow was there first, standing between the woman and the door, his body tense, his eyes fixed on her with an unspoken understanding. He stood guard, his posture protective, like a silent sentinel. "Please," the woman whispered, her voice weak and desperate. "Please don't let him find us." James's mind raced. He had never seen this woman before, yet there was something hauntingly familiar about her. She looked like someone who had been through too much. Her clothes, expensive, but now torn and soiled, spoke of a life much different from the isolation of his plantation. "Who are you?" James asked, his voice low and cautious. "My name is Catherine," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the barn entrance. "Catherine Wells." She looked down at the baby in her arms, her eyes filled with both fear and love. "This is Hope. Please, you have to help us." James felt a chill run through him, not from the cold, but from the weight of her words. He had lived a quiet, secluded life for 5 long years, ever since his wife, Emily, had passed. He had buried himself in his work, finding solace in the steady rhythm of the coffee plantation and the quiet companionship of his dog, Shadow. But this was something different, something dangerous. He glanced down at Shadow, whose eyes had not left Catherine. The dog's gaze was filled with an understanding that James couldn't quite grasp. There was something in the air tonight, something that felt wrong. "What happened?" James asked, his voice low, as if the very act of speaking might make things worse. I'm running from him," Catherine stammered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "My husband. He's been hurting me. And now he's looking for me." James's heart clenched. He had lived through his own grief, his own losses. He knew what it was like to carry the weight of a life shattered. But this was something darker. "Who's he?" James asked, his voice harder now. "Richard Thompson," Catherine said, her voice trembling. "He's powerful, dangerous, and he won't stop until he finds us." At the mention of Richard Thompson, something stirred within James. He had heard that name before. Rumors whispered in the back rooms of the town, in the shadowy corners of the world he had long since turned his back on. Richard Thompson was a name tied to wealth, to power, to corruption. But none of that mattered now. James had made a promise to himself after Emily died. He would live for her dream. He had buried his grief in the land, in the coffee plants, in the stillness of the Montana landscape. He had promised her that he wouldn't let the plantation die with her. But now, as the cold wind howled outside and the baby in Catherine's arms continued to cry, James knew that promise was about to be tested in ways he had never imagined. Shadow's growl broke the silence. Low and steady, the dog's eyes flicked toward the door, his ears back, a warning in his stance. Before James could react, the sound of tires crunching against gravel reached his ears. A vehicle was approaching. "Get inside," James ordered Catherine, his voice sharp. Now, Catherine scrambled to her feet, still holding the baby tightly. Shadow followed, moving as if he were an extension of her own body, guiding her toward the safety of the house. James stood frozen in the doorway, staring out into the darkened driveway. His heart raced as the car drew closer. The figures inside were still hidden, but James could feel the danger closing in, just like the storm clouds that rolled across the sky. He couldn't protect her from the past, but he could protect her now. This was no longer just about a man and his dog. It was about something much bigger, something Emily had built long before he understood the full weight of her vision. Shadow growled again, low and fierce, and James felt the truth settle deep inside him. This was just the beginning. The night was heavy with tension, the kind of stillness that presses down on your chest and makes every breath feel too loud. Inside the farmhouse, Catherine had settled into a small corner by the fire, holding Hope close to her chest, as if she could somehow shield the baby from the world outside. Shadow, ever watchful, lay at her feet, his eyes scanning every shadow, every flicker of light, as though he was waiting for something. James stood at the window, watching the black Mercedes parked at the edge of the property. His heart pounded, but it wasn't just the vehicle that set him on edge. It was the feeling, the unmistakable sense that something far larger was at play here. Something that went deeper than just a frightened woman and her baby. The car had stopped by the gate, its headlights cutting through the night like a predator stalking its prey. James knew who it was without having to look. The man had introduced himself with a smile that never quite reached his eyes, a smile that made James's skin crawl. Richard Thompson. The name clung to the air like poison. And now, it seemed that poison had come for them. James's eyes moved to the stairs, to the door where Sarah had gone to check on Catherine. He wasn't sure why, but he felt a deep, unsettling sense of déjà vu. 5 years of living like a ghost, 5 years of isolating himself in the silent company of Shadow, and now everything was unraveling. The life he had rebuilt after Emily's death was crumbling in front of him, and it wasn't just his own world that was at risk. It was hers, too. He glanced at Shadow, whose body was tensed. Still alert, his eyes fixed on the barn. The dog had been more than a companion, more than a pet. He had been Emily's last gift to James, a bridge to a past that he had buried deep in the soil of the coffee plantation. Now, as Shadow's protective instincts guided the dog's every move, James couldn't help but wonder if Emily had known more than he realized. If Emily had been building something far bigger than a coffee plantation. If this place had been meant to be a sanctuary, not just for him, but for all those who would need it. James, Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts, her tone low and filled with urgency. "We need to talk." She stepped into the room, her face pale. She was holding something in her hands, a business card, Richard Thompson's card. James felt the weight of it settle into his gut. "What's happened?" Sarah stepped closer, lowering her voice even more. "He's here, James. He's looking for Catherine. He wants her back." James's jaw tightened. He didn't have to ask why. The bruises on Catherine's arms, the fear in her eyes. He could see the truth now. Richard Thompson wasn't just a businessman. He was a man with secrets, with power, and power that he would go to any lengths to keep. "They'll be coming for us," Sarah continued, glancing at the window where the black car still sat, waiting. "They'll come soon, and we won't be able to protect Catherine unless we're ready." James nodded, his mind already moving through the possibilities. He had spent 5 years burying his emotions, focusing only on the plants, the farm, and the quiet. But now it was different. Emily's death hadn't just taken her away. It had put him in a cage of his own making. And now, that cage was being rattled open by someone far more dangerous than he could have ever anticipated. "We need to get Catherine out of here," James said quietly, his voice firm. I already have her in the safe room, Sarah replied. But James? I don't know how long we can keep this up. Richard has connections. He has people everywhere. Shadow's ears perked up, and for a moment, it seemed like time itself slowed. James looked down at the dog, who had moved to stand by his side. Eyes locked on him with that strange, knowing gaze. Do you trust him? Sarah asked, her voice filled with a quiet disbelief that only those who hadn't seen Shadow's loyalty could express. James knelt beside Shadow, his hand brushing over the dog's dark fur. I don't think I have a choice anymore, he said softly. I trust him more than I trust anyone else. Shadow's eyes seemed to hold a depth of wisdom that sent a shiver down James's spine. The dog had always been there, in the quiet moments, in the darkest times. And now, just as it had with Emily, Shadow was leading them. But where? Catherine sat in the small safe room, cradling hope close to her chest. Her body trembled, not just from the cold, but from the fear that had begun to consume her. She had spent years under the thumb of Richard, trying to escape, trying to keep her sanity intact. But now here she was, hiding in a room on a cold Montana plantation with a dog who seemed to understand her every emotion. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play here. She closed her eyes, resting her head against the wall, listening to the sounds of the house around her, the crackling of the fire, the faint shuffle of footsteps, the occasional low growl from Shadow as he stood guard outside the door. For the first time in years, she felt safe. But she knew that safety was fleeting. James had promised her that he would protect her, but the truth was, Catherine wasn't sure she could be saved. Not from the man she had married. Not from the life she had been forced into. She had no idea what Richard would do when he found them. But she did know this. He would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. The question was, could they survive him? The air outside seemed to hum with tension, thick and electric. James paced back and forth inside the farmhouse, his boots clicking on the old wooden floors. He had spent 5 years in solitude. 5 years working the land, keeping his head down and avoiding the world. But now, the world had come crashing into his quiet life, and everything he had worked for, everything he had promised Emily, was at risk. He stopped in front of the window, his eyes scanning the darkened driveway. The black Mercedes still lingered at the edge of the property, its headlights cutting through the night like a predator waiting to strike. James, Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts, pulling him away from the window. We can't keep waiting. If they're coming, we need a plan. James turned to face her, his face grim. I know, he said, his voice low and strained. But I don't know how we're going to keep Catherine safe once Richard gets here. He won't stop until he finds her, Sarah said softly, her eyes full of concern. And he's got people, James. He's not just some rich businessman. He's a monster. James nodded, his hands clenching into fists. He had never been afraid of much, but this was different. Richard Thompson wasn't a man who played by the rules. He had power, wealth, and connections that stretched far beyond what James had ever imagined. And now, that power was bearing down on them. Maybe we don't have to fight him alone, Sarah suggested, glancing at Shadow, who was sitting at James's feet, his eyes watchful and alert. You're not the only one who cares about this place. James, we've got people. The workers, the sheriff. They'll stand with us. They won't let anything happen to Catherine or Hope. James looked down at Shadow, whose dark eyes locked with his. The dog's gaze was steady, almost as if he understood the weight of the moment. He had always been more than just a dog. He had been a protector, a guardian, a bridge to a past that James hadn't fully understood until now. Emily built this place for more than just the coffee, James said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. She built it for family. And that's what we are now. We're family. All of us. Shadow, you, the workers, even Sarah. And we'll protect it. Just as the words left his lips, the door to the farmhouse opened. Sarah stood in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. They're here, she said simply. Richard, he's outside. James's heart skipped a beat. He turned to Shadow, who was already moving toward the door, his body tense and alert. The dog knew what was coming. He had been waiting for this moment, just as Emily had prepared them all for it. James followed Shadow out onto the porch, the cold wind biting at his skin. The black Mercedes had pulled up near the front gate, its sleek body gleaming in the dim light. Richard Thompson stepped out of the car, his polished suit looking out of place in the harsh rural landscape. His face was hard, but there was something in his eyes, a mixture of rage and desperation, that made James's stomach twist. "Mr. Parker," Richard said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "I thought we might have a little chat. I'd like to take my wife back." James's jaw tightened. "She's not your wife anymore, Richard, and she's not going anywhere with you." Richard's smile faltered, but only for a moment. He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of James and Shadow standing together. "You're making a mistake, Parker," he said coldly. "This doesn't have to be difficult. You don't want to make this harder than it needs to be." James stood his ground, his body stiff with anger. "The only thing that's going to be hard is you try and take her. This is where she belongs. And if you're looking for a fight, you've come to the right place." Richard's eyes flicked to Shadow, who was standing protectively beside James, his teeth bared in a low growl. The dog's posture was unmistakable. He wasn't going to let anyone near his family. "You're making a big mistake," Richard repeated, his voice laced with venom. "You really think you can stop me? You have no idea what you're dealing with." "Actually, I do," James replied, his voice cold and unwavering. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with. You're a liar, Richard, and you're not welcome here. Now leave, before things get worse for you." For a moment, Richard said nothing. The tension between them hung thick in the air, the only sound the steady growl of Shadow, whose eyes never left Richard's. Then, without warning, Richard's hand darted to his pocket, and James's heart leaped into his throat. But before Richard could make a move, Shadow was on him. The dog lunged forward, snapping at Richard's arm, pushing him back with a force that sent him stumbling. "Get back," Richard shouted, his voice full of panic. "Get the dog off me." James stepped forward, his own anger rising. "I warned you," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't touch my family. Not while I'm breathing." Richard stumbled backward, his hands raised in a futile attempt to protect himself from Shadow's relentless attack. The dog's teeth were inches from Richard's skin, his growl growing louder with every step the man took backward. James moved closer, his eyes never leaving Richard. "You're done, Richard. This is the last time you'll ever threaten anyone on this land." Behind him, Sarah emerged from the farmhouse, her face a mask of determination. "James," she said, her voice firm. "We need to go. Now." But James didn't move. He was rooted to the spot, his eyes locked on Richard. For a moment, everything felt frozen in time. The man who had caused so much pain was finally facing the consequences of his actions. And then, like a predator trapped in a corner, Richard made his move. He lunged forward, pulling something from his jacket, a gun. James's heart raced as Richard aimed it directly at him. But before Richard could pull the trigger, Shadow was there again. Faster than lightning, the dog lunged, knocking the gun out of Richard's hands, sending it skittering across the gravel driveway. In that moment, James realized something. Shadow wasn't just protecting him. Shadow was protecting everything Emily had worked for. The plantation, the legacy, the family. And now, it was time for James to do the same. The gun skittered across the gravel driveway, a clink of metal lost in the wind. For a brief moment, everything went still. Richard Thompson stood frozen, his hands outstretched as Shadow's teeth bared in a snarl, still poised over him like a vengeful ghost from the past. Shadow's growl deepened, a warning, one that Richard was far too familiar with now. But this was different. This wasn't just a man fighting to protect his wife. This was a dog who had been trained to defend, to sense danger, to understand the unspoken needs of his family. James moved quickly, his heart racing, his thoughts a blur. "Get inside," he barked at Sarah, his voice sharp. "Now." Sarah hesitated for only a moment before nodding, her eyes filled with understanding. She knew this wasn't just about protecting Catherine and the baby anymore. It was about protecting everything Emily had built here, everything they had fought for. She turned and rushed back into the house, the heavy door creaking as she slammed it behind her. James didn't take his eyes off Richard. The man was trembling now, his polished demeanor shattered, the facade of confidence slipping away like sand through his fingers. Richard's face was flushed with anger, his lips curled into a sneer as he tried to regain some semblance of control. "You think you can keep me out of here?" Richard spat, his voice thick with disdain. "You think this is over? You have no idea who I am, or who I have backing me." James stood firm, his body stiff with determination. "I know exactly who you are, Richard, and I know exactly what you've done. You think you can just waltz in here, take whatever you want, destroy whoever stands in your way? Well, you're wrong. This ends now." The sound of a door opening behind him made James flinch. He turned to see Catherine standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with panic. She was still clutching Hope in her arms, the baby's small form wrapped tightly in a blanket. Shadow's eyes flicked to her for just a split second before he returned his focus to Richard, his stance unwavering. "James!" Catherine called out, her voice trembling. "Please don't. Stay inside," James shouted, his voice louder than he intended. "This is not your fight." But it was too late. Catherine had already stepped outside, the cold wind whipping around her as she moved cautiously toward James. The look in her eyes was one of fierce resolve, a mother's love and determination burning bright. "You don't understand," Catherine said softly, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "He's not just after me. He's after everything. He wants control of this place, of the plantation, and he'll do anything to get it." James's heart sank. He had known there was more at stake here than just Catherine's safety. But hearing her speak those words, hearing the fear in her voice, made it all too real. "Then we fight," James said, his voice firm, as he turned to face Richard once more. "We fight for everything Emily built, for everything we believe in. You're not taking anything from us." Richard's eyes darkened with malice, his posture shifting as he took a step forward. "You think you can stop me?" he asked coldly, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're nothing, just a grieving man and a dog who can barely protect his own. You're weak. You've always been weak." James's fists clenched at his sides, his anger bubbling to the surface. "Weak?" he spat. "You think I'm weak because I didn't become like you? Because I didn't chase power, greed, and destruction? I'm not weak. I'm alive, and I have everything I need to protect what's mine. My family, my home." Richard lunged forward, his fist raised in a final, desperate attempt to break James. But before he could make contact, Shadow was there again, leaping with precision. The dog tackled Richard to the ground, sending him sprawling in the snow. Richard's cries echoed in the cold night air, but Shadow wasn't letting go. The dog had always known his duty, to protect, to guard, to keep his family safe. And in that moment, Shadow was the embodiment of Emily's strength, her wisdom, and her foresight. "Shadow," James called, his voice urgent but calm. "Enough." With a final growl, Shadow released his grip on Richard's arm, stepping back to James's side. The man was panting, his face red with rage and humiliation. He glared up at James, who stood tall, his gaze unwavering. "Get off my land," James ordered, his voice low and full of authority. "I don't care who you think you are. You're not welcome here." Richard's eyes flickered with a mixture of fear and rage. But he didn't move. He simply stared at James, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You're making a huge mistake," Richard sneered. "This isn't over. You'll regret this." James stepped forward, his eyes locked on Richard's, his face hardening with resolve. "No, you're the one who's made the mistake. This ends tonight." For a long moment, the two men stood in the snow, staring each other down, their breaths visible in the frigid air. Then, without another word, Richard slowly rose to his feet, his eyes never leaving James's. He turned toward his car, his movements stiff and filled with fury. Without looking back, he climbed into the Mercedes, slammed the door, and sped off into the night, the tires screeching as the car disappeared down the long driveway. James stood motionless, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Catherine's voice broke the quiet. Is it over? James turned to her, his heart heavy with the weight of everything they had just faced. For now, he said, his voice tired but determined. But we're not out of the woods yet. We have to be ready for whatever comes next. Shadow, still by his side, gave a soft bark, his tail wagging slightly, as if to remind James that they weren't alone in this fight. The days following Richard Thompson's hasty departure were tense, yet strangely quiet. James could still feel the weight of his presence lingering in the air, a shadow that threatened to resurface at any moment. But for now, the plantation stood undisturbed, the wind carrying only the sounds of the rustling coffee plants and the occasional distant crowing of a rooster. Inside the farmhouse, James paced the length of the living room, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his worn jacket. He had always been a man of action, someone who thrived on the steady rhythm of his work. But now, with Emily's absence still a wound in his heart, he felt the world shifting beneath him. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. Catherine and Hope had settled in, their presence a quiet reminder of everything that had changed. Hope, a tiny bundle of warmth and life, had become the heart of the farmhouse. Her innocent giggles and coos a balm for the scars left by years of grief. Catherine, though still haunted by the fear that had brought her to the plantation, had begun to find her strength again. She was no longer the frightened woman who had stumbled into their lives. She was becoming part of their family. Shadow, as always, was the quiet sentinel, ever watchful, his eyes always on the alert. But even the dog seemed to understand that their peace was fragile. It would take only a spark to ignite the storm that still loomed on the horizon. James's thoughts were interrupted by the soft creak of the door. Sarah stepped into the room, her face serious, but her eyes betraying a hint of relief. She had been a steady hand through it all, the one who had kept everything from falling apart. "James, it's time," Sarah said softly, her voice laced with determination. "We have to finish what Emily started." James turned to face her, his heart heavy with the weight of the responsibility that now lay on his shoulders. He had promised Emily that he would protect this place, that he would honor her legacy. But now, with the truth about Richard coming to light, he realized just how much more was at stake. It wasn't just about protecting a plantation. It was about protecting everything Emily had built, the community, the sanctuary, the future she had envisioned for Hope. "I know," James replied, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "We have the evidence. We know what Richard did, what he was trying to do. But the real fight is ahead of us. We can't let him destroy everything." Sarah nodded, her gaze firm. "We won't. We got the support we need. The workers, the sheriff, the whole town, they're with us. And Shadow, he's not going to let anything happen to us." James looked down at Shadow, whose eyes met his with an understanding that only the dog could convey. Shadow had always been more than a companion. He had been a protector, a bridge between the past and the future. Emily had trusted him to guard her legacy, and now James knew that trust wasn't misplaced. "We're ready," James said, his voice resolute. "But we need to move fast. Richard won't give up. He's already lost control. And when a man like him loses control," Sarah's eyes hardened, "he becomes more dangerous." Exactly. The plan was set into motion with careful precision. The town had rallied behind them in ways James could never have imagined. Sheriff Wilson had called in backup from nearby counties, and the local workers had discreetly bolstered the security around the plantation, reinforcing fences and ensuring that no one could approach without being seen. In the kitchen, James, Sarah, and Catherine gathered around a table littered with maps, documents, and phone numbers. Catherine, despite the tremor in her hands, had proven to be more than just a victim. She had been Emily's cousin, part of the family that Richard had tried to erase, and her knowledge of the inner workings of Richard's life had given them the key they needed. "Emily knew," Catherine said quietly, tracing a line on the map. "She knew we'd have to fight this battle. That's why she made sure the evidence was safe. She trusted all of you, all of us." James nodded, his eyes dark with the weight of everything they were about to face. We're not just fighting for us. We're fighting for Emily, for hope, for the future she built here. Outside, the wind howled, but within the walls of the farmhouse, there was a quiet strength that seemed to emanate from the very foundation of the plantation. The community had become a fortress, and the bonds they had forged in the face of adversity were unbreakable. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the plantation, James stood by the window, his eyes scanning the land he had once thought was just a place to grow coffee. Now it was so much more. It was a sanctuary, a home, and it was worth fighting for. "I've lived for this place," James murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "But now I live for something else. I live for family." Sarah stood beside him, a soft smile playing at the corners of her lips. "And we'll protect it, all of us." Just as the words left her lips, the sound of tires on gravel reached their ears. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, the crunch of the gravel unmistakable. James's heart skipped a beat, and he turned toward the door. "They're here," he said, his voice low but filled with determination. "This is it. Time to finish what Emily started." The confrontation was imminent. The sun had set, and the plantation was bathed in shadows. James stood at the front door, his hand on the old wood, feeling the weight of the years pressing down on him. This wasn't just about keeping the plantation safe. It was about protecting the family they had become, about defending the legacy of a woman who had believed in the impossible. Shadow stood beside him, his posture alert, his eyes fixed on the approaching vehicles. James could feel the dog's presence like an anchor, steady and unwavering. Emily had entrusted Shadow with everything she couldn't say, everything she couldn't protect herself. And now, Shadow was doing exactly what he had always been meant to do. He was guarding the future. The headlights of the approaching vehicles illuminated the driveway, casting long shadows across the ground. James could hear the engines, the crunch of tires on gravel, the unmistakable sound of power and aggression. Richard Thompson was back, and this time, he wasn't going to walk away. But neither would James. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was a fight for everything Emily had built, for everything they had become. And with Shadow by his side, James knew they would win.